Okay, well, thank you very much, Gina, for the introduction there. It's great to be with you again. I've decided to talk today about the first chapter of Genesis. You don't need me to tell you that Genesis chapter 1 has been discussed a great deal by Adventists, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are some of you here today who, when you saw the topic, said, oh no, not Genesis 1 again. However, normally when in Adventist circles, when we discuss Genesis 1, what we normally do is we step straight out of the text and look at the challenges of this text for our 21st century context. And then we tend to focus on, what is of significance for us in the 21st century. So before you know it, we've gone straight from Genesis 1 to discuss scientific matters, creation, evolution, the age of the earth, and related matters. However, I'd like to do something a little different today because Genesis was around for millennia before the evolutionary theory that we know of raised its head. And yet in its historical context, that is in the world from which Genesis arose, it was in conversation, in dialogue with the worldviews of its time. And if we are aware of how it dialogues with the worldviews of its time, I think we get a good insight into what Genesis was aiming to do, what the focus of the text of Genesis. Because as the title suggests, while Genesis 1 was written for us, it is our scripture, that's true. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. So that's what I'd like to take a bit of a look at today. For whom or to whom was Genesis first written, and what kind of a world was it written? And one of the main points I want to make is that I think it's obvious that Genesis was aware of conflicting worldviews. It was aware of the myths which neighboring nations had. If Genesis had not been aware of the mythologies in the cultures surrounding it, in Mesopotamia and Egypt in particular, then Genesis would have had different details and different emphases, because Genesis 1, like every other part of the Bible, was written in a particular historical context. And if we can understand that context, it helps us to understand the text better. And in seeing its context and how it relates to those conflicting worldviews in the cultures surrounding it, we get a much better view of what the theology of Genesis is. And if we can get hold of what I might call the core theology of Genesis, it adds greatly to the spiritual value of Genesis for us. Many times I think Genesis 1 has become fodder for arguments about this, that, and the other. But I think ultimately we want to consider what the spiritual value of this chapter in the Bible has. So my approach is this, what we're going to do. I'm going to give a presentation. I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit longer than Gina's 30 to 40 minutes, not too much longer, but a bit longer. And what I hope to do is to present in that presentation to answer this basic question. What do we see if we read Genesis 1 in its ancient context? So that's the basic question I'm addressing. And then the second item I'd like us to address is the so what question. Having seen what I presented, well, so what? What is its relevance for us in the 21st century? And what I hope is that we can really address that in the discussion that comes afterwards. You know, the questions that you raise and my responses, I hope we can have that as part of that, that section of our time together. Just one very brief introductory comment to creation, and that is that we tend to think of creation in our cultural context as a self-contained topic. So we talk about creation, and when I mention creation, then we know what we're talking about. We're talking about typically creation, evolution, the age of the earth. It's a self-contained topic, but that isn't really how it operated in the ancient world so much. Creation and creation texts were means for exploring meaning and significance. And that is true for Genesis, and it's also true for the mythologies of the Mesopotamian Valley and Egypt as well. So that is, although these texts seem to talk about the how and the what, their major aim is to get beyond the how and the so what, and really to deal with the so what, the questions that what it means to be human. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? So with that, let's start by taking a look at the first verse of Genesis. Now, I realize that this is so familiar that I hardly need to have a slide showing this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. However, because it is so familiar, I think we don't always appreciate just how radical this opening verse of the Bible is, because this opening verse takes us to the limits of time. In the beginning. Well, you can't get back beyond the beginning. So it takes us from an earth-centered point of view to the limits of time in the beginning. And it also takes us to the limits of space, because God created the heavens and the earth. And this is a Hebrew idiom, an idiom known as a merism, in which we have two opposites which convey totality. That is to say, the heavens are the highest point above, the earth is the lowest point below, and everything in between. In other words, in the beginning, God created everything, or the universe as we might think of it. So the first verse takes us to the limits of time and the limits of space, or as we might put it, God is presented as the Lord of time and space. Now, immediately, we've seen that puts Genesis in some kind of conflict with the generally accepted worldviews surrounding it. And as we move into this element, I just need to explain some terms, a bit of jargon that I'm going to use concerning origins. These two terms, just helpful to bear these in mind and their meaning. First, cosmogony. Now, cosmogony is concerned with the origins of the cosmos, the universe we see around us. That's cosmogony. But there is also theogony, and theogony concerns the origins of the gods. Genesis 1 is concerned, as I'm sure we'd all agree, it's concerned with the origins of the cosmos. It isn't concerned with the origins of God. So the concern of Genesis is cosmogony. However, in ancient Near Eastern mythology, these mythologies are both cosmogonic and theogonic. They're concerned not just with the origins of the world, but the origins of the gods, whereas Genesis isn't. In fact, the entire Bible just assumes the eternity of God. It never gets into the origins of God. So let me illustrate that from a couple of sources. What we're trying to do now is to read Genesis in its ancient context. Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is the sometimes referred to as the Babylonian epic of creation. Now, it's actually concerned with more than simply creation, quite a bit more, but it does include creation. And so this is how the Babylonian account begins. This is their equivalent of Genesis 1, verse 1. When on high no name was given to heaven, nor below was the netherworld called by name, when no gods at all had been brought forth. So that's where we are. And you notice it's at the point when no gods at all had been brought forth. So this is a text which is theogonic as well as cosmogonic. It's going to tell us how the gods came into existence. That is Mesopotamia. We have a similar concept in Egyptian texts as well. In Egypt, one of the creator gods, Amun, this is what is said of him. He is the one who crafted himself, whose appearance is unknown, perfect aspect, who evolved into a sacred emanation, who built his processional images and created himself by himself. So here you have the concept of self-creation, but this God has a beginning and he creates himself by his own creative power. But both of these, Enuma Elish and this Egyptian text, are theogonic, that is concerned with the origins of the gods, not simply with the creation of the world. And so Genesis is in stark contrast to that. There is no statement, no speculation about the origins of God. And while Genesis is cosmogonic, it is in no way theogonic. Now, there is also in these ancient texts an important connection between cosmogony, the origins of the world, and theogony, the origins of the gods. So I have a statement here from an Egyptologist, John Currid, and looking at this connection between cosmogony and theogony. He says, ancient Egyptian theogony was truly cosmogonic, for each of the gods fashioned was a personification of an element of nature. So let me just comment on this then. In Egyptian texts, when we see physical objects and natural phenomena being created, while that is cosmogonic, it's how the world comes into existence, it is also the way in which the gods are fashioned. In other words, there is an overlap between the origin of the gods and the origin of the cosmos, because deity, divinity, runs through the physical world. So it's much more like a pantheistic view of the relationship between deity and the world. Okay, some little bits of that got a bit technical, but we're going to be becoming a bit more basic as we move on. So an important distinction, another distinction to make then between these texts we've just looked at, Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts, is that in Genesis, there is a clear distinction made between the creator and creation. Now, for us, I mean, that's so obvious that we hardly think we need to say it. But Genesis makes a distinction between the creator and creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God in Genesis is external to and sovereign over his creation, where in many ancient Near Eastern texts, there is the distinction between the river and the river god. That distinction is not so clear. Okay, let's look at the initial situation in the creation account. Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was a formless void, or without form and void in the King James Version. It was a formless void. Darkness covered the face of the deep, while the Spirit of God swept over the face of the waters. So here you've got this formlessness, this kind of chaotic state. You have darkness. But in addition, you've got the deep, and this is what I want to concentrate on first. The deep. Darkness covered the face of the deep. God's Spirit is sweeping over the face of the waters. So you have water covering the earth, these primordial waters. And you have the same situation in the worldview of Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. So if we go back to Enuma Elish, we have waters there as well. Primeval Apsu. Now, Apsu is male freshwater. So Apsu was their progenitor. And matrix Tiamat, she is the female saltwater. So Tiamat was she who bore them all. They were mingling their waters together. So you get this idea, we have these waters again, fresh water here and salt water mingling together. And what happens next? Well, then were the gods formed within these two. Within what two? Well, Apsu and Tiamat, fresh water and salt water. From them, gods were formed. And there's a similar situation in Egypt as well. This is talking about the arrival of the god Atum. On the day that Atum evolved, and how does he evolve? Well, out of the flood, out of the waters, out of darkness, out of lostness. You notice you've got the same kind of situation as in Genesis. You've got the waters, you've got darkness, and lostness seems to be the Egyptian way of talking about disorganization and chaos. So you have virtually the same concept in this Egyptian text as you have in Genesis 1 verse 2. But there is a striking difference, because in Babylon, the gods emerge from the waters. In Egypt, the god emerges from the waters. But in Genesis, the waters are inanimate. God is sovereign over the waters. He will later divide the waters above from the waters below. He'll divide the waters from the dry land. So God in Genesis exerts authority and sovereignty over the waters. In Genesis, God does not emerge out of the waters. Initially, at the very beginning, he is exercising his sovereignty over them. So waters in all of these three accounts, but a very different concept in Genesis compared to the other two. So by the time we get to the end of verse 2 in Genesis 1, a pattern is beginning to emerge, which shows Genesis as being out of step with what these Egyptian and Mesopotamian theologies are saying. However, there's enough similarity to cause us to compare one with the other. They're not so dissimilar that they're completely different, but the Genesis presents a different perspective. So Genesis is beginning a kind of polemic against the theology of its time. Now, what I've just said then at this point may seem like a little bit of an assertion, but I hope to have demonstrated it in a bit more detail by the time we finish. Genesis 1 verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, one of the traditional questions, apparently in some rabbinic schools, was for the, when they got to this verse, was for the rabbi to ask his students. Now it says, God said, "Let there be light." Now, to whom was God speaking? And that question was intended to force people to see this, that God is not speaking to anyone. He is simply making a declaration that God speaks and it happens. What he commands takes place. So as we might put it, it shows God having control over matter, God having control over energy. Let there be light, and there was light. The main significant point here is that Genesis shows God creating effortlessly. And this is something repeated time and again in Genesis 1. So let's just look at a few examples. There's the one we've just looked at, which is God said, let there be light, and there was light. I noticed Trond has raised his hand. Was that wanting to ask a question or make a comment?
Why don't we wait for comments at the end?
Yeah, okay. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. So God creates light effortlessly. God says it and it happens. Verse 9, then God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God commands, and it happens. In verse 11, then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and it was so. All that is necessary for creation to emerge is for God to command it, and through the power of his word, it happens. Well, we know that. Any of us who've read Genesis don't need to be told that. It seems so obvious. However, when you read this kind of effortless creation against what we read in other texts from the same time, it's a very different situation, because in Mesopotamia, for example, creation was the result of a struggle, of a battle against the gods, between the gods. It has a technical name, actually, technical term. It's called theomachy. Let me show you from that Babylonian text that we saw before, Enuma Elish. And here you've got a section where Marduk defeats Tiamat. Now, Marduk is the high god of Babylon, and Tiamat is a fearsome female monster of the deep. And Marduk engages Tiamat in battle. So let's see what happens. The Lord, that's Marduk, the Lord trampled upon the frame of Tiamat. With his merciless mace, he crushed her skull. He cut open the arteries of her blood. And he goes on for a while. He calmed down. Then the Lord was inspecting her carcass, that he might divide the monstrous lump and fashion artful things. He split her in two, like a fish for drying. Half of her he set up and made as a cover, heaven. So notice what happens here is that you have this conflict between Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk overcomes Tiamat, slays Tiamat, and then he separates her. He divides her in two, and with one half of her, he creates the heavens, and with the other half, he creates the earth. So we have creation as the end result of conflict, which stands, of course, in great contrast to what we read in Genesis. Let there be light, and there was light. Now, this separation, this division of Tiamat into two halves, with an upper part and a lower part of her body, we can compare that profitably with what we read in Genesis, because in Genesis 1, there is quite a lot of separation and division going on in the chapter. So, in verse 4, God separated the light from the darkness. Verse 7, God made the firmament and separated the waters that were under the firmament from the waters that were above the firmament. in verse 9, let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. In other words, God separates the waters from the dry land. Verse 14, and something similar in verse 18 as well. Let there be lights in the firmament of the sky to separate the day from the night. So more separation. And then on the seventh day, let's not fail to see this, that God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. He made it holy. That is, he set it apart. He set apart the holy from the common. So there are several acts of separation and division in Genesis 1, just as in Enumere Elish there is the splitting and separating of Tiamat's corpse, to make heaven and earth. The difference is, of course, that in Genesis, this all takes place in response to the simple command, let there be, and it was. It was so. There is no conflict. There is no battle in Genesis. And the reason for that is that this is one of the theological implications of the monotheism of Genesis. There are no other gods. There are no other opponents with whom God can battle. There is just one God acting by himself. So again, we see similarities. Notice that there are similarities. We've still got separation and division in both texts, but of a different order. Now, we don't have time to deal with everything in Genesis 1, so I'm going to move on to the fourth day. This is one of the most significant days in the account. And on the fourth day of creation, heavenly bodies are created on the fourth day. When you look at the account of the fourth day, and this is, I think, even more obvious in Hebrew than it is in English, it is the longest description so far in creation week. And the reason why it is longer is because the account wants to stress and keeps repeating the functions of these heavenly bodies. So it's not just telling us about the heavenly bodies coming into existence. It is talking about what they do, what is their function. And Genesis wants to make abundantly clear what their function is. So let's have a look. And God said, let there be lights. Okay, so in other words, that's what he's making. What's he making? He's making lights. All right. Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them be lights. Well, that's what they are. They are lights, and they're going to be lights in the dome of the sky. And what do lights do? To give light upon the earth. So, dear reader, I hope you've got that point so far. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky, would you believe it, to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. Now, what does God create then? Well, what Genesis is saying is this, look up at the heavens, look up above you, and what do you see? You see lights. Now, that's all they are. Now, that would have been scandalous to most people in the ancient Near East. They would have responded, well, what do you mean they're lights? they're not just lights, they're gods. Because for the ancients, the heavens were divinized. So it wasn't just the sun and moon and stars, it was the sun god, the moon goddess, the astral deities. And so because the heavens were divinized, and what you saw were not just lights, but gods, it meant that those lights, what you think in Genesis are simply lights, those heavenly bodies affected human experience on earth, because what happens up there determines what happens down here. And based on that, then this was the basis for the basis for astrology, divination, in interpreting the position of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and what happens, and therefore knowing what is going to happen on earth. So let me just illustrate how that happens. Here's a text, a Mesopotamian astrological text. An eclipse of the evening watch means plague. An eclipse of the middle watch means diminishing market. An eclipse of the morning watch means the sick will recover. So do you understand what this text is saying then? It's saying that what happens up there determines what happens down here, depending upon the time of day when it happens. And so it goes on, when sin, now sin is the name of the moon deity. So when sin, that is the moon, makes an eclipse, you must also consider the month, the day, the watch, the wind, the path, and the positions of the stars as they stood during the eclipse. And then you can give the decision in accordance with its month, its day, its watch, its wind, its path, its star. That is, if you are tuned into the fact that these heavenly bodies are deities, you will be able to predict and to interpret how what you see in the heavens is going to play out on earth. So this is the beginning of, signs of the zodiac, astrological prognostications, because that's what those heavenly bodies are. They're gods. Genesis says, no, they're just lights. And that's the reason why, I believe, so much repetition on the fourth day of creation in Genesis to say they're lights, they're lights, they're lights, they're lights, not gods. So Genesis turns its back then on any form of astrology, and also on the fatalism that can attach to it. We've been born under a certain star, and well, there's nothing else we can do about it. There's also another aspect, I think, which has theological significance here. Even a first reader of Genesis 1, so somebody who's reading it for the first time, which in my experience is often, first-year undergraduates, have an obvious question when they read Genesis 1. That is, look, on the first day, it says, let there be light, and there was light. But the sun and the moon, stars, they don't appear until the fourth day. So how can you have light on the first day when the light bearers don't appear until the fourth day? Well, obviously, the answer must be, so it said, well, the sun, moon, and stars must have already have been there, and they just are revealed on the fourth day. Now, I would argue that this is a pretty modern rationalistic explanation. And I think the explanation is not rationalistic, trying to work out that. It is rather a profound theological point, which is that God is the source of light. He creates light on the first day and has no need of the sun, the moon, or the stars. On the fourth day, God hands over responsibility for the light to the light bearers. And so that's another way of saying, of course, do not worship creation, do not worship the sun, the moon, and the stars, rather worship the God who created the heavens and the earth. And one other point on this fourth day. I've been talking about the sun and moon, and yet, as we all know, Genesis doesn't call them the sun and moon. It calls them the greater light and the lesser light. It mentions the stars as well. Well, why not just call them the sun and the moon? Why call them the greater light and the lesser light? Well, one reason, of course, is that it's emphasizing function, which we've already looked at, that these are just lights and not gods. But another reason, I think, could be that the Hebrew word for sun, Shemesh, is also the name, or comes from the same root as the name of the sun god in Semitic languages. So Genesis doesn't even want to use the word for sun, lest it leads to some speculation that it could be talking about the sun god. No, 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 we're not talking about gods at all. It's just the greater light. And also, he says he made the stars also. It's almost like a giveaway phrase, just a couple of words in Hebrew, and the stars. Because in ancient Near Eastern or Mesopotamian interpretation of the heavenly bodies, stars were of the greatest significance. It was stars of first importance, then the sun and moon. But the stars of greatest significance in Babylon and so on are just dismissed, and the stars. So on the one hand, we're being told what God created, but we're being told it in such a way as to make a theological point and a theological counterpoint to what you read elsewhere. All right, let's move to the sixth day. Now, on the sixth day, we have the creation of land animals and human beings. Genesis wants to make this clear, that land animals and human beings have a lot in common. How do they have a lot in common? Well, they are created on the same day. They live in the same environment, dry land. They eat the same food, vegetation. So land animals and humans have quite a number of things in common, but human beings are not simply animals, because uniquely among all of God's creation, human beings are made in, or you could translate it, human beings are created as the image of God. Nothing else in creation is made as or in the image of God. Now, what does it mean when it says that God created humans as the image of God? Oh, dear me, you know, you could float a battleship in the ink that's been spilled over the years, explaining what the image of God means, some of it flying into the philosophical stratosphere. Now, I don't have time to chase every rabbit down every hole on this question, because there's just too much to deal with. But I'll just mention maybe the obvious thing, or a couple of things. First of all, whatever it means when the Bible says that we are created as the image of God, one basic thing it must mean is that there is some relationship between God and human beings. There is something which draws these two together. And beyond that, what else might the image of God mean? Well, there are many things that we could say, but a major point, I think, is this, that in the ancient world in which Genesis existed, it was the custom for kings and emperors to erect images of themselves throughout their territory. Sometimes they would include, a monumental inscription with the image of themselves, images of themselves that they placed in their territory. And those images that were placed throughout their territory were representations of the king's authority. I'm the one in charge, as it were, right? In Genesis, it is human beings who are the image of God in God's creation. And in that sense, being God's images means that human beings are God's representatives on earth. They have responsibilities within God's creation. But of course, the honor of being images of God. So the significance of humanity is a point clearly made in Genesis 1. Within the broad sweep of God's creation, human beings have status. They have importance. Well, once again, there are some strong contrasts between that view of humanity that we read in Genesis and what we read in the texts of Israel's neighbors. In the another of the Mesopotamian mythological texts called the ATSS epic, the gods come to the goddess Mani and they ask her this question. They say to her, will you be the birth goddess, creatress of mankind? Create a human being, that he bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the task of Enlil, one of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of God. So these gods who come to Mami and they say, will you help create human beings? What are they asking for? Well, it's this. These gods, these are the lesser gods, the Gigi gods, they are fed up with the drudgery of all the hard work they've got to do in the world. Really just fed up with the task that they've got all week long working. So they will create slaves to do their work for them. And who are these slaves? Human beings. That's what it says. You see the bottom line. Let man assume the drudgery of God. So in this concept, human beings are slaves who take away the drudgery of the gods. In Genesis, human beings are God's representatives who rule God's world. It's a strikingly different view. So in Genesis, humans are significant to God and they have high status, and that is a very different view of humanity. This statement by John Walton, an Old Testament and Near Eastern scholar. In the ancient worldview, people were slaves to the gods, with no dignity other than that which came from the knowledge that the gods could not get along without humans to meet their needs. So that's what we're here for, to do the dirty work for the gods. And finally, because obviously speaking to an Adventist group, we can't miss the seventh day. The concept of rest is found obviously in Genesis, but it's also found in Mesopotamian and Egyptian creation texts as well. So let's see how that works before we draw this to a conclusion. So in Genesis 2:1 and 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he'd done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Let's have a look at Enuma Elish again. Once Marduk has defeated Tiamat, the rest of the gods come to Marduk and they say, "What courtesy may we do you? We will make a shrine whose name will be a byword. Your chamber that shall be our stopping place. We shall find rest therein." And so here the gods are talking about finding rest. Where? Well, in Marduk's sanctuary. And in fact, a sanctuary as a resting place is an idea which occurs in the Old Testament as well, in Psalm 132. But well, for the moment, let's just notice what they're saying. They're talking about rest, but that's going to be rest in a Marduk sanctuary, all right? And then in Egypt, in the Memphite theology, Ptah is called he who made totality and caused the gods to evolve, who gave birth to the gods from whom everything has emerged, offerings and food, God's offerings and every good thing, and a few other things are mentioned. So has Ptah come to rest after his making everything. And here, what happens is that this god Ptah, well, he stops basically. There's no real any more significance than simply stopping, resting from what he's doing. So in both Genesis, Mesopotamia and Egypt, there is this concept of rest at the end of the creative process. But these are different kinds of rests. In Genesis, the rest on the seventh day is the climax of the account. I know that is perhaps not what we often hear, but that's my conviction, is that the seventh day is the climax of the creation account. And this is what the account has been moving towards, the blessing and sanctification of the seventh day. So Genesis concludes with God's rest and holy time, okay, holy time, because God blessed and made holy the day. In Enuma Elish, the gods talk about resting in Marduk's sanctuary. So the emphasis here is not on rest and holy time, but rest and holy space. That's what a sanctuary is, holy space. And then in Egypt, as we've seen, Ptah stops, rests, but there's no particular significance. He just comes to the end of what he's doing. So neither in Mesopotamia nor in Egypt is there any concept of creation in 7 days, nor therefore any idea that the seventh day is in any way sacred or any suggestion of Sabbath rest or anything like that. Okay, let me summarize then as I draw this to a conclusion in the last 2 or 3 minutes. What are the similarities between Genesis 1 and the ancient Near East? Now, obviously, we could say much more. This is just a select few. What are the similarities? Well, Genesis, like the mythologies of Mesopotamia and Egypt, they all begin with primordial waters. Also, they all begin with a lack of organization or chaos that needs to be brought into shape. So they agree on that. All of them have acts of separation to produce an ordered cosmos. So they agree on that. And all of them have this concept of divine rest, but as we've just seen, that concept is not identical in the three. Each seems to be distinct, but they all talk about divine rest. So those are some of the similarities between Genesis and the world surrounding it. But just as important as the similarities, in fact, probably more important, are these are just selected differences between Genesis 1 and those other ancient mythologies. In Genesis 1, God's existence is assumed. There's no speculation or statement about where God comes from. Whereas the ancient Near Eastern mythologies are concerned with theogony. That's an essential part of their account. They are cosmogonic and theogonic accounts. Genesis is based on monotheism, there's just one God, and the other mythologies are based on polytheism. Now, this distinction between, well, it's more than a simple surface distinction between one God and many gods, because there are a number of important consequences which flow from this. In Genesis, creation is effortless. There's nobody else there to challenge God. There's no squabbles between the gods. There's only one God, so God speaks and it happens. But elsewhere, because there are many gods and sea monsters and whatever, there are struggles, there are arguments. It's a very different context. In Genesis, God is transcendent and he's external to his creation. God, the creator, creates the heavens and the earth. So in places like Enuma Elish and those Egyptian texts, the gods are immanent within creation rather than external to it. In Genesis 1, the heavenly bodies are lights. That's it. Under the direction of God, of course, but they're lights. In the ancient Near East, the heavenly bodies are gods. That's a huge contrast with great significance theologically and for the experience of human beings in their everyday lives. In Genesis, humans are the image of God with status and responsibility. As we saw, for example, in the Atrahasis epic, humans are slaves of the gods, a real contrast. So those are similarities and differences. I think there is no doubt that when Genesis was written, it was written with one eye on these competing views, and that Genesis is not just written in a vacuum, giving us data and information. It is written in a cultural context, and it is making a point about a very different kind of God and a very different kind of creation. So I just want to finish with this statement. When read in its original context, Genesis 1 challenges ancient assumptions about the nature of God, the world, and humanity. It would be a pity if we failed to allow it to speak theologically to the fundamental questions of human existence in our own time, and to challenge our assumptions about God, the world, and humanity. And perhaps also challenge some of our assumptions about the purpose of Genesis 1. So thank you, and I hope as we move now into the discussion, we can reflect on maybe some of the things I've said, but also you may want to also address the question of the, so what kind of questions.